Welcome to Bio 2024. It's been quite the tumultuous year for U.S. intellectual property. 2 years ago, almost to the day, the World Trade Organization agreed to a TRIPS waiver on COVID mRNA vaccines. Then on December 8th, 2023, the Biden administration released a draft framework guidance for the exercise of Marching rights in the Bayh-Dole Act. I'm Dwayne Schultes, and on this Vital Health podcast, I'm speaking with Hans Sauer, the Deputy General Counsel for Intellectual Property for the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, Bio. Hans is considered to be one of the world's leading patent attorneys and experts in the biopharma sector. Hello, Hans. How are you, sir?
I'm pleased to be here, and you're so kind with your introduction.
It's great to have you here. I don't think I told any fibs or lies. We're also joined today by my colleague, Gwen O'Loughlin. Gwen ran our research project on Marching rights and is an expert on health data and Medicare and Medicaid. Hello, Gwen.
Hello, thank you.
It's great to have you here. So, Hans, let's kick things off right away here. What is the current status of the TRIPS waiver and the mRNA vaccines and everything that's going on at the World Trade Organization?
Okay, so the current status of the TRIPS waiver, I think that would refer to the TRIPS waiver that was actually decided in June of 2022 by the World Health Organization.
Yeah.
Right, so that one is limited to intellectual property relating to vaccines, and that discussion is and was separate from more recent discussions about expanding the TRIPS waiver to any other kind of COVID-related product. So the status of that TRIPS waiver is that it is enforced. It's been enforced for 2 years. It will likely remain enforced for another 3 years. It is also supposed to be reviewed annually in the World Trade Organization, but these reviews haven't really happened in a meaningful way. In fact, the TRIPS waiver has, to our knowledge, never been used by a single country anywhere in the world in the 2 years since it was decided.
But they were talking about doing this expansion to potentially all therapeutics, and that could be aspirin. It could be everything.
And that was one of the big conceptual problems around discussions of, should we expand the TRIPS waiver from vaccines to COVID therapeutics? You're right. People throughout have had an idea of what it means when we talk about a COVID vaccine. What people had an idea of what these products look like and what that refers to. The question of, okay, now when we talk about a COVID therapeutic, what do we mean? That was much less clear. That was, I think, apparent in discussions in Geneva. It was one of the bigger conceptual problems around negotiating an expansion of the waiver. And yes, it could be aspirin, but it could be anti-inflammatories. It could be bleach, for all we know.
Yeah.
So what different countries, we also know this, have had different views on what they deem a COVID therapeutic to be. And that, too, I think, contributed to the confusion around what are we expanding what would we be expanding the COVID waiver into? At any rate, right? So with all these discussions and these conceptual problems being in the room, what happened ultimately was that the WTO basically ended further conversations on expanding a TRIPS waiver. There was no decision to end discussion forever. The discussions this time just petered out, and they're generally deferred to some other unclear later point in time. I think what we can take away from the latest round of WTO negotiations is that the idea stays alive. The idea could be resurrected at any point in time. And at any rate, the idea migrates from the World Trade Organization to other international organizations in Geneva as if it were almost a traveling circus, because ideas keep walking around to different agencies.
So it's a clown car. Basically, it moves around.
Yes, I don't want to be too dismissive, right? Because the World Health Organization certainly went through a long, arduous and very emphatic process of negotiating the outline of a pandemic treaty. Right? And that's where the idea migrated from the World Trade Organization into discussions of a World Health Organization pandemic preparedness treaty.
So what's the Biden's position on that treaty right now with regards to therapeutics? I mean, is the Biden administration supporting this, or are they being rather furtive in how they want to commit?
In the World Health Organization, I think it's fair to say that the negotiators for the United States, in this case from the State Department, so not from the World
USTR.
from USTR, but the WHO negotiations were conducted primarily by negotiators from the State Department. I would say in those, the U.S. negotiators were rather more critical. I think were rather more restrictive in what they were willing to give. And I think their thinking was also affected by a number of complications that didn't exist at the WTO, because the Pandemic Preparedness Treaty has many, many other elements other than the idea of tech transfer and IP waivers. Right? There were other things in there that were equally unpalatable to U.S. negotiators. So, and there too, negotiations over a pandemic treaty didn't conclude by the deadline in the World Health Organization, and they will probably continue for at least 1 or 2 more years. And in this day and age, it means it's going to be discussed indefinitely until something happens.
That represents something of a climb down from the initial position of USTR regarding the therapeutic portfolio, because they were really pushing for this.
Yes. Were they pushing for it?
At least
maybe if you ask them, they would say, no, we're evaluating it. But they certainly didn't push back on it.
Correct.
Right. And throughout, I think that's characteristic of at least this administration's actions in the World Trade Organization. The U.S. kept continuing to be very passive in the WTO. Right. After first having agreed in principle to an IP waiver for COVID vaccine IP, after that, no very clear statements actually did come out of USTR, one way or another.
And why do you think that is?
I can only speculate. I think part of it is internal to USTR. USTR, I think, has been working for a couple of years on trying to figure out what it means to create a genuinely progressive trade policy for the United States. I think the U.S. Trade Representative, Katherine Tai, views her agency as one plank of Bidenomics, however defined. Right? And that created, I think, a number of questions. Why? Because just like I think this administration has had, some difficulty communicating what it means by Bidenomics, by its own progressive industrial and economic policy. In the same vein, I think this administration has had difficulties articulating charting a new course for U.S. trade policy. I think it's maybe a level of confusion and difficulty of communicating concepts that run through several aspects of the administration when it comes to trade.
So do you think this? Do you then on that note? Then do you think that it's dead? Are they just going to talk about it and then just sort of hope it goes away?
Well, things never die, unfortunately. So is it dead? No, it's definitely not dead. Is it on life support? It's more like a zombie.
Okay.
I would think it's the undead. Right? It will probably never die unless it's decapitated, which I don't see happening.
Okay. Well, we'll get a machete and see what we can do. So as I mentioned in my introduction, in December, the Biden administration, under the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, released a draft interagency guidance framework for considering the exercise of Martian rights. What does this mean, the exercise of Martian rights, Hans? What are we talking about?
Well, we have some experience with the Bayh-Dole Act and with proposals for marching rights. Now, they've never been used, as you know. Right? Federal agencies, mostly those dealing with drugs, so mostly NIH.
Sure.
Have received, depending on how you count, maybe a dozen petitions for the exercise of marching rights over the decades. It's been pretty consistent agency policy so far in the adjudications under administrations, both Republican and Democrat, that the Bayh-Dole Act is probably not a very good tool for regulating drug prices. And that has usually been the basis for requests to invoke margin authority. And the various administrations that have faced this question have always denied these requests. The most recent denial of a margin petition was in the spring.
Extended last year.
That was in March of last year. So what does it mean for industry? Well, we haven't done that experiment. So no government, no U.S. administration has ever marched in on the basis of a product price or any other reason, really. We have, however, done another experiment, which shows, I think, the sensitivity of industry and industrial collaborators to these kinds of propositions. And that is in the early 1990s, and I know you want to come back to that. NIH did have in its CRADAs, Collaborative Research and Development Agreements, had for a period of about 5 years a policy whereby, as part of entering into a CRADA, the U.S. government would expect resulting products, if any, to be priced, quote, reasonably or accessibly. And that did empirically lead to a decline in CRADAs that were signed by collaborators. Industry did continue to enter into CRADAs with other agencies, but NIH really felt what it believed was the effect of this policy. It was reviewed. It was rescinded by then Director Varmus.
Yes.
I want to say that would have been 1995.
1995 it was rescinded, and the CRADAs went up 8x, eightfold.
In the next year.
The next year.
So the effect was like very dramatic. It was very immediate, and it's hard to say that there was no causal relationship to this.
Well, the critics would say that's just, it's because they introduced another program grant at that time that caused a 800% increase, of course.
I do believe that NIH itself refuted that idea.
NIH's own research highly refutes that. That's correct. Now, this gets us to the research that we did. You mentioned that we looked at this issue, and I'm going to bring in my colleague, Gwen O'Loughlin. Now, Gwen and I worked with you on this project, and I have to give you a lot of credit, Hans, because one of the critics and one of the reasons why people didn't want to do this research was, well, we don't know what we're going to find, and we might open up a Pandora's box and find, wow, there's a whole bunch of stuff you could march in on. And you and I and Dr. Joe Hamming, my colleague, we all kind of agreed, well, it's best to figure it out, and at least we know, as opposed to someone else figuring it out. So you rolled the dice with us, and we're very grateful for that. Now, Gwen, I handed this project to you, and we needed to figure out a way to look for that public interest statement that's published by the NIH. And you came up with a very novel approach working with the law library at the University of Wisconsin, where you were studying at the time. Can you tell us what you did and how you worked through that?
Yeah. So first, I think, it kind of piggybacks on another research project we did where we found where all the drugs were actually invented, over the last 20 years. So, and that included biologics. And I think what was also interesting with this is we took patents. We could find the patents for all the biologics, or many of them. And we did that through the court cases. I looked at.
But let me just jump in here, because Hans, normally you can't get the biologics.
They're not quite so easy to find.
So when you say the court cases, what do you mean specifically?
So I went and I looked at, what exactly are they trying to protect? What exactly are they going to try to say, no, we want an extension on this particular patent? And I thought, okay, well, these must be the mechanism of action or the composition of matter patent. And it turned out to be correct. So that was kind of the first step in that, in finding those patents. And then after that, I worked with the law library at the UW-Madison, and I found a tool called the Lens, which was giving me the ability to search patents, which you cannot do typically.
Yeah, because you have to be able to dig into those PDFs.
Right.
And this was like the first time you could pump that in there. And you built an algorithm to do this.
I did. I built an algorithm to do this because you have to have a specific sentence in any Bayh-Dole patent. It must be in there. So that's the government interest statement. And any of the patents that I searched, I put my algorithm in there, and then any patent that had a government interest statement popped out.
Now, what's interesting when you say we looked for the patents to see where they invented, we should clarify. You did some really granular work there. We got to the point, most studies, 90%, 95% of the studies would say, okay, this is a GSK GlaxoSmithKline drug. That's a UK invention. But you didn't do that. You actually went down and would look at where the professor was based on their LinkedIn profile at the time.
Right.
So we actually dug really deep to get this out. Now, how many patents are we talking about here? How many patents did you search for these 350 drugs? What are we talking about?
There was close to 3,000 patents.
Patent by patent.
That's right.
Wow. Okay. So ultimately, what did we find?
Well, we didn't find very many drugs.
In a nutshell, we only found five. And of those 5, 2 of them are imaging agents, 2 of them are cancer drugs that have subsequently been withdrawn. We saw no revenue since 2019. And the only drug we found, frankly, was Xtandi, the drug that everyone's tried to petition over the last, it's 5 or 6 petitions over the last 10 years or something like that. Hans, were you surprised by this result?
I was heartened by it. Can I? No, I was not terribly surprised because the question had been explored in the past using different methodologies, earlier techniques, earlier cohorts of drugs. So I think in the literature and among like people who've been watching this space, there was a sense that among all the drugs that are on the market, there probably won't be that many who owe their existence to federally funded research in some form. So, for example, there had been earlier publications that looked at all the patents in the Orange Book, which, for the benefit of the readers, that's a compilation of all the patents that claim small molecule drugs, and that's officially published by the FDA. So people have been looking at that body of patents, and they found that less than 10% of all drugs had like even one patent attached to them.
Right.
And what was it? What was our finding? What was it? 92%? Is that right?
That's correct.
So only 92% of our drugs had
none.
No government interest statement, no patents.
And you're right. I mean, some of them also, it had to do with manufacturing as well. I mean, sometimes the process, things like that, but not mechanism of action or composition of matter.
Part of the criticism we'd had a lot of people say they were really concerned about the biologics. Like, we think it's going to be, 13, 15, 20%. And that we didn't see that at all.
Nope.
Not at all. And I guess it has to do with the fact that, biologics are really a lot more complex. I think a lot of this is more industrial engineering and industrial research. So it kind of makes sense intellectually, but there was a real fear around this.
There was, some concern. And I thought your study was new in that respect. So certainly, I think in that sense, you actually had looked at something that people hadn't quite looked at before. You looked at the same question, taking a different approach. I think the consistency of your findings with what people had previously sensed, and so it was also very heartening, right? Because I think to me it confirmed that yes, this was actually a solid study. It was true. It was true data. I'd also maybe add to that, just saying, 10% of all drugs, let's say small molecule, or all drugs have one patent or so that owes its existence to federal funding. That doesn't mean the drug owes its existence to federal funding, right? Because drugs, like other products, are complex products. They embody a number of inventions. I think you can think of a drug like any other complex product as a bit of a jigsaw puzzle of technology. Right? Somebody must come and put that whole thing together. You source certain pieces at the beginning. You have to invent others along the way. You source additional ones. And eventually you complete the puzzle. And if one or two of these pieces owe their existence to federal funding and the rest doesn't, what have you gained? If you pluck out one piece of the puzzle through margin and give it to somebody else, that won't allow anyone to replicate the drug. You may have ruined the puzzle. Yeah. Right? But you haven't really helped anyone replicate the drug free and clear of IP rights or found any other way of getting access to the basket or stack of technology that's embedded in the drug. So that too, to my mind, was an important aspect of your finding. Now, you did find some drugs where all the jigsaw puzzle pieces, if you will, do owe their existence to federal funding.
That's correct.
So
very few.
But you said earlier, that's a small number. That number was 5.
5 out of 350, give or take.
Yeah.
And what was intriguing, Hans, as well, about, we came out of the gate quite early with this and got a huge amount of press and interest in congressional, quoting of the study, and you got a lot of visibility. But then there was a study that came out a couple months later from the National Economics Research Bureau that basically said the same thing. They looked at 800 drugs of the Orange Book over 20 years, and they found, about 2%. So again, roughly an analogous result. So it seems like this should be getting put to bed. Yet.
Well, and the reason is Well, if you want to control drug prices, why would you march in on 2% of all drugs and not the rest, which you can't reach, right?
Well, I think, unfortunately, the question then becomes, do we think just for optics is a very, obviously, like with the TRIPS waiver that we've just established, this was done mostly for political reasons, not for practical reasons to actually do anything. It's just there for optics. Do you think that they may just march in on one of these drugs just because they're going to be performative before the election?
It's anyone's guess.
Yeah.
Now, we do have, as you mentioned, a new framework for the exercise of margin rights that didn't exist a year ago. And that framework, arguably, if it were used, right, could be used to march in on, I guess, some of the, or at least one or two of the drugs for which people have tried to march in the past. Now, the odd thing to my mind, as a lawyer, I think that's a very strange proposition because as a matter of administrative law, well, it doesn't feel like good governance to decide the same question one way 3 times, which is denying it. And then when you're asked again, suddenly you're going to start saying yes. And the only thing that changed is the administration and the people who run the process, right? So absent showing anything else that changed in the economy, that changed in U.S. health policy or so, it does look like it's a very plain political reorientation of longstanding policy. And in administrative law, that's normally not very acceptable, but it's certainly not productive for industry to change the rules of the game, because they can change back. What happens if the next administration is different and they have a different perspective on the matter? Are they going to start denying these petitions again when they were approved in the past? Right. So there's got to be more than just a change in political winds. As a matter of good governance, I think this is a real question. We're very concerned still about this margin framework that was proposed by the administration. It's been hugely controversial, right? And the timing of the release of your study, I thought, was very fortuitous. Nothing, to my knowledge, was planned.
No.
But your study came out like literally, the week before the framework was released?
6 days before the framework was released.
Yeah, so it couldn't have been, and I don't know how fortuitous that is, right? But it couldn't have been more I think more impactfully timed.
I think people thought there was some grand Machiavellian cunning plan, and we had a whole inside line, that Gwen was doing something, with a Ouija board or something like that. But in fact, it just was luck. It was just plain and dumb luck. And we just knew we had to get it out. We knew the ruling was coming out from NIST, and we just decided, well, let's just do it now. And it just turned out that when we did so, it was a week before the Biden administration dropped this ruling, and it was quite shocking. Gwen, I have another question for you, Gwen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this was really novel territory. This hadn't been done. And you and the law team from the law library at the University of Wisconsin were really trying something different. What was their reaction when you started working with them? What did they say about it? Were they surprised as well? Were they expecting more impact?
It was I had to be trained on the system, right? The lens, because it was something new and I hadn't ever looked at it before. And when I was telling him about this project, he said, "Oh, that is very interesting. We haven't ever thought of looking at it this way before." And so it was new. I mean, they weren't so into the results, I would say, that were just more about what I was thinking and how I was building it, and thought that was quite interesting. So I can't say that after I did the project that they wanted to know more or approached me again, but they were very interested in the fact that I was looking at it from a lens of through court cases and trying to get the biologics and things like that, because it wasn't typical. But I think my background with working in law firms and then going through Medicare and all that training and stuff, that to me, it just made sense to go and look at it that way. Because the purple book isn't very helpful.
Yeah. And why is that, Hans? Why was it decided that biologics weren't going to put the patents in, unlike the orange book with the small molecules? Why do we have that distinction there with the IP?
The distinction goes back to the different approval standards that are being used in the United States for small molecule drugs versus biologics. So for small molecule drugs, we've long had a pretty stringent standard of identicality, right? Sameness.
Yeah.
The FDA does expect a very high degree of sameness for small molecule generic copies of reference products. And it was understood from the beginning that for biologics, that degree of sameness, certainly when the legislation was passed, the BPCIA was passed, that degree of sameness just couldn't be achieved. Biologics have to be merely similar, not identical. And I think what was understood by Congress at the time was for intellectual property purposes, a biosimilar could be different enough from the reference product, but still be a biosimilar, but could be different enough to avoid the patents that claim the reference product. And in a way that wasn't quite as possible for small molecule drugs. So people said at the time, we're not going to require a listing of patents that claim the reference biologic because these may or may not be relevant to a biosimilar. Right? Biosimilars have been known to design around innovator products, actually quite frequently. But in light of like this disparity of approval standards and the level of sameness you can require, it was felt that it doesn't make sense to require biologics companies to create a listing, innovators, to create a listing of all the patents that claim their own product, because you might very well be facing a biologic that doesn't infringe any of these, but is still a biosimilar. What we have instead is the Purple Book. So you're right, the Purple Book operates by a very different mechanism. The patents that are listed in the Purple Book are the ones that the innovator identifies as part of the BPCIA patent dance after having seen the regulatory submission of the biosimilar.
Right.
So in other words, for biologics, the innovator, for their patent listing purposes, the innovator needs to list the patents that they own that claim the biosimilar, not their own product, necessarily.
So it's in many ways it's based by the competitor.
A lot of it has to do with the information that the competitor provides and the development choices the competitor made. It's partly for that reason, for example, that we see so many manufacturing process patents in the biologic space. When they're being litigated, many of those aren't patents on the molecule or the formulation. Many of those are actually on methods of manufacturing.
And so what Gwen did then was slightly go further upstream before that, and we captured that data before it flowed through, which was really quite unique and quite brilliant, Gwen, honestly.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, no, it was a great way to approach it, and again, a really novel way to go at the problem. Now, there's one other, as if this isn't enough, there's one other wrinkle about this ruling on the Marchand rights and the NIST guidance that's been issued. If Marchand rights comes in, right, they're trying to do so around rhetoric on drug pricing, but for example, Google was developed with a DARPA grant. I mean, this goes way broader than just drug pricing, Hans. I mean, this could put a wrench in the entire network framework for all innovation across all U.S. academia. I mean, do they really understand what they're doing here?
I think academia really woke up to the implications of this once they saw the draft framework being published. In the past, I think academic institutions, even though they're very important stakeholders, right? They are the originators of most of the IP that we talk about. There's another block of IP in the Bidot space that's generated by small companies that receive SBIR grants and others. But for the most part, it is academia whose ox would be gored. And it showed in the comments. So we've seen, I want to say, maybe 30 or so of the biggest research universities in the country, including all the higher education associations. But individual universities, name them Yale, Northwestern, University of California, UCLA. Yep. The list really is a pretty long list, and they wrote in on president letterhead saying we're very concerned about this framework. And this is not a discussion about drug pricing. They were all very clear. This is a discussion about innovation policy. And the framework as it was proposed, really felt very misguided to them. So they did speak up. Academia spoke up. Economic development organizations around the country, not specific to drugs, spoke up. Patient groups spoke up. I thought it was a very interesting showing of non-traditional actors who usually have been circumspect about their views on the exercise of Marchand rights, who are now on record with well-reasoned comments that are all visible in the Federal Register, and that, as far as we know, are still being digested by NIST. Right? So we haven't heard any further steps about implementation or finalization of this draft framework. We're hearing rumors that the Department of Commerce, which promulgated this proposal, is being urged to move forward. Just last week, there was a letter by Senator Warren and Congressman Lloyd Doggett urging the Department of Commerce to finally finalize this guidance because of 52,000 comments that were submitted to the Federal Register. 85% are in favor of the framework. Now, there's more to be said about that. It is true, 52,000 comments were submitted to the National Institutes of Standard and Technology in response to this framework. So what's been found is that almost 85% of these comments were actually computer-generated form letters by people who don't engage with the framework. Right? It really became an exercise in talking about drug pricing and malcontent, discontent with the pharmaceutical industry that was being fed into the system in 50,000 comments. But there was very little discussion in the vast majority of these comments of the framework itself. In fact, civil society groups, NGOs, who have long been in favor of exercising margin rights likewise wrote in, right, and said, well, we're in principle in favor of doing this, but we don't believe that this proposal will work. And they validated the findings of your study and what others have been saying, and that, yeah, it's true, it won't reach enough drugs. This doesn't make sense as a drug price control measure.
How did they get it so wrong? I mean, there are several academics that have been funded by think tanks that have been going around for 10 years, banging this drum. Why were they so wrong? I mean, did they just think they weren't going to get caught out? Did they hope it was right? Were they just on an agenda? What happened, Hans?
No, I think they have a different perspective on the exercise of almost raw government power on industry, right? So what I've heard said often by credible academics who acknowledge, this is not going to reach a lot of drugs, right? This won't work very well as a drug price control measure. But then these same academics may go on and say, yes, but, if industry is put under enough pressure, right, we just need to try it one day. We need to just start using this system, and industry will buckle, if you will, under enough pressure. In their mind, this is a legitimate exercise of regulatory authority. Other people might say it's a form of bullying, right? And it's an unlawful exercise of government regulations to achieve goals for which they weren't designed and that they don't authorize. But at the same time, I think academics say, if you deal hard enough with industry, you will achieve something, because a government can be a pretty powerful thing to confront if you're a company. So there is a belief that somehow, even though the law doesn't look like it's really suitable for this purpose, even though the regulations don't look like they will bite and apply for this purpose, doing it anyway, but forcefully enough, is going to help move companies into a different form of behavior, conduct, and the like, right? So again, to some people, this is a form of bullying. To other people, it's a proposal to try a new form of regulatory interaction with the industry and see if they'll comply, buckle, cave in, as the case may be. One example that's often being brought forward is, you may remember, the anthrax crisis.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And Bayer, the maker of the antibiotic, which one was it? I forget.
I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but yes. They had they put out, and AstraZeneca both put out multispectrum antibiotics about that time. Yes.
Right. And so people now, after more than 20 years, in hindsight say, well, that was a great exercise, right? Because the government threatened to march in, and then the companies lowered their prices, right? And so we could be doing this all the time. Except what happened during the anthrax crisis wasn't an exercise of Bayh-Dole. These weren't Bayh-Dole patents at all.
No.
Right? This is something that's not being discussed very much. And the point is not Bayh-Dole, right? The point is government coercion And the example of what happened during anthrax and after anthrax, when broad-spectrum antibiotics were bought for a national stockpile, those examples are being used not as an example of how to use Bidol. Those examples are being used to illustrate like the power of government coercion, like the raw exercise of government power is going to produce results. And that, I think many academics view the Bidol framework a little bit in the same way.
It's a tool that they can use to pry open the market around healthcare. It's a way in.
Yes, even though it's on its face technology neutral, right? As you said, right? Nothing in the framework talks about drugs specifically.
No.
But but here we are.
So Gwen, you just did a graduate degree at the University of Madison. You were dealing in health informatics. I mean, this is sort of the knife edge of healthcare. What were your colleagues and other academics' opinions about the industry? I mean, was there a realization here that there's an attack going on, or were they in the other opinion that, yes, this is all evil and the industry should be cut down? And I mean, what was your experience dealing with people at university level right now?
Definitely industry is bad. That is really the core of it. Yeah, they don't see it from the other side. It's yes, drugs should be, the pricing, everything should be free, basically, is what I got out of academia. Even in my science degree, there weren't many people that had actually worked in industry. They went right from their bachelor's to their master's. And my experience was a bit different, as I had many years between my bachelor's degree and my master's degree. So I could bring with me all kinds of experiences and different points of view that hadn't been considered. So I do think that I may have had some influence on some of the students that...
Well, we hope so.
Now, if I may ask this, right? You've probably heard it said, well, but come on, even if you didn't find very many drugs to which this would apply, you still have drugs, at least some, that were invented with federal funds, developed with federal funds, so the public already paid. It's these drugs in particular where, if they're high-priced, people find them particularly offensive, right? Because they were developed with public money, not with private money. And what would you say to that? Because, this is also an area in which you've done research.
Yeah.
Like, how big is the federal contribution to these drugs? Do you know? Do you have a sense? Do you have a ballpark idea?
Well, we do know.
We do know.
Yeah, I mean, we looked at this. We did a study that was published in Therapeutic Innovation and Regulatory Science. I mean, it's orders of magnitude. It's, 90 times more goes to the private sector. It's 600 million to 600 million. We looked at over 8,000 patents that came out of the NIH from the year 2001. Okay, and why did we choose that? Because it takes roughly 20 years for an NIH patent to come to market as an actual therapeutic. It takes about 20 years to go from lab to an actual product. So what do we see? We looked at 40,000 NIH grants. From that, we found 8,000 patents. And from those 8,000 patents, we found 41 drugs that came into clinical research. And from those 41 drugs, we found 18 approvals. Okay, now that's a lot of numbers. But so we went from roughly 40,000 to 18 approvals. Now, of those 18 approvals, there was about $600 million in total over the entire time that came from the NIH, compared to $48 billion that came from the private sector. Now, we stopped at the moment of FDA approval. We didn't do post-marketing, extended labels, acquisitions, post-marketing acquisitions, exercise of partnership agreements, like on a drug that came to market, and then, okay, we're going to buy you as a terms of our agreement. If you throw that in, Hans, you're pushing $100 billion. So we're talking huge numbers, less than 1%. Less than 1%.
Yes. So so one example that I can think of, it goes back to the drug that was the subject of the most recent March in petition. I believe that drug involved a federal grant to UCLA.
Yes.
in reportedly in the approximately $200,000 something ballpark, $200,000
Correct.
was the research grant. Right? The company later reported
$2 billion.
Approximately $2 billion to go the rest of the way.
Yeah.
To my mind, it's a very interesting proposition to ask, okay, given these numbers, like how much of a lower price, if you will, would the government feel entitled to? On the basis of its contribution relative to what everybody else contributed. right? Because that's normal commercial thinking to my mind. If we were to make a deal, a licensing deal, so that would be a consideration, right? How much do you bring to the table? How much do you expect us to put in? And then we'll divvy up what we each expect from the deal, right? To me, it seems that a lot of proponents of the use of bidole margin don't consider this calculus at all, right? They bring very
None
little
whatsoever.
commercial thinking to their own propositions that they develop.
It's even worse than that, Hans, because there was a study that we found here out of the University of San Diego in the early 2000s where they looked at the growth of the San Diego biotech sector from 1990 to 2000. Radif Martinu was an academic here at the University of San Diego. And what did he do? He said, let's look at predictive factors that would predict a biotech company's success, actually becoming a successful company and spinning out. And what did he find? He found that actually being a spin out of the university itself was a predictor of failure. A higher predictor of failure. Not statistically significant, but it trended towards failure. Now, Harry Bowen, the economist I work with at Vital Transformation, we said, that's interesting. Let's expand this a little bit. So Harry and I built some statistical models. We did logistic regression models looking at what happens if you hold private funding steady and you increase public funding in these 41 drugs with the NIH funding that we found. What did we see? If you held private funding at the midpoint and you increased NIH funding, the probability of market entry with a statistical significance went down. In fact, the more money that came from the public sector from NIH funding was a predictor of failure in our cohort, whereas the exact opposite relationship was for the private sector. Once you saw the private sector have 90% of the total funding mix, and if you combined all the funding and the private sector was over 90%, you had almost a 99% probability of market approval. So the private sector really is the driver of market success, whereas we see almost a negative indicator in public funding, which is a very unfortunate and, shall we say, a difficult thesis, but the numbers are the numbers. That's the math.
Do you think it could be that the private sector is quicker to recognize likely failure of development? And
yes.
Yeah.
Because what's also interesting is the amount between failed products between phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. The highest spend is in phase 2, not phase 3. That was another really interesting finding. So no, we've walked all over this issue, and we had a very, very important publication that caused a lot of trouble. So let me ask you, Hans, let's say, again, let's just say the Biden administration decides they want their bumper sticker slogan, we're going to march in October, we're going to march in on Xtandi. What happens?
I think there will not be a company in the U.S. that doesn't, first of all, pay attention. Well, there won't be a company in the U.S. that doesn't go through its whole portfolio to see, oh my goodness, did we ever license anything in from, a publicly funded institution that has federal money attached to it? I think it would put a bullseye on a range of products. And certainly, I think it's going to teach everybody a lesson very quickly to say, maybe we should go elsewhere for finding new and interesting technology. And that's really, I think, one of the takeaways from the margin framework, right? Because it has been said also in response to your study, right, where you said, well, it's not going to reach a lot of drugs. It won't work for drug price control because there are almost no drugs to which it would apply. To which it has been said, well, then
why do it?
Then why not do it?
Exactly.
Right? Because why are you screaming? It's not going to hurt your industry by your own admission. The point is, I think that's true. Right? It's not going to hurt the companies that make products today. The companies that are going to be hurt are the ones that are in early stages of development. In other words, it's not the companies that sell drugs or other products that are going to be hurt. It's the companies. Coming. It's the companies that sell nascent inventions.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And the universities that shop around nascent technology looking for a partner. It's those that are going to be affected by this. And that's why they all commented. That's why the universities were so prominent in responding to the margin framework. They recognized this dynamic.
There was something else that was really funny about the research, Gwen, and that was when you identified, that 8% of bidole patents in the products that we had, some of the companies were unaware
Yes, that's correct. I had to send them the patent and where the actual language was. And yes, here's a patent to your drug that
because we de-identified it when we put it out, but initially we'd put the names of the drugs, and we get a lot of companies going, what? We have binocular exposure? It was really quite funny, completely unexpected. Were they happy about this, Gwen? I mean, what would you say? Could you typify their reaction?
Shock was more of it. Are you sure? Was the question I got, and it was yes, I am sure. You can run it if you'd like. It's all right here. So, but I would say that, with using the lens and having this, it was very hard previously to find out if any of them had it, the government interest statement. So, it being new and looking at a biologic, that was a harder point.
Hans, we're coming into an election. I think a lot of people feel that, obviously the Biden administration has been hugely aggressive against the industry. And there's a lot of people saying, well, maybe if Trump and the Republicans get in, it'll be better. That's a little short-sighted, I think, because I remember H.R. 3, we have still with bio an injunction against most favored nations. The Trump executive order, our research was filed with bio in that injunction. Trump has said in May of 2023 he's going to open up margin rights and attack that injunction and try and bring it back into force. What do you think happens? Does anything change, or is this just going to continue to go down a spiral?
I would expect, this idea of the most favored nation clause or preferred pricing clauses, right? A promise to, if you sell it to the U.S. government for price X, that you won't sell it for less to somebody else. Those ideas, I think, will keep being around. I do think a Trump administration would revisit the most favored nation concept, right? So that won't go away. I think in other respects, things might change, right? A putative Trump administration would want to differentiate itself from the policies of the Biden administration, even just for that. Whether they agree substantively or not may not even be the primary driver. I would expect, though, if we had a different administration, that the pressure on the exercise of margin rights would probably come off, and they would look for other mechanisms that they've already tried and have been thinking about in the past administration. So everything that's old will be new again on some level. But I do think it would take heat out of some of the problems that we're dealing with right now in this particular administration. Margin rights is not the only thing that's being discussed.
No.
Monica Bertagnoli, NIH director, I think was interviewed only a week or two ago. She was asked about margin rights, and she said something like, I would hate to ever have to use margin rights. I would hate to have to do this to the industry. So we have another idea. Right, and she referred to a proposal that is now also published in the Federal Register coming out of the NIH, which basically says if you want to license technology from NIH intramural programs as a condition of these licenses, and that includes non-exclusive licenses, as a condition of these licenses, the government will expect, if you contract with the NIH for an intramural license, that the licensee, as they progress during development and as they get closer to product approval and maturity, will submit a market and access plan to the administration. The plan is described as laying out the pricing of the product, the design of the product, how it's going to be sourced and distributed. It must meet certain DEI criteria, which are also administration policy. So in other words, the NIH is talking about not a resurrection of the reasonable pricing clause, but the resurrection of something else that arguably goes beyond, because they're now not just talking about, we want to know what price you have in mind,
but it's your whole design plan, your marketing
how it's going
plan,
to be designed, how it's going to be sourced, right? So in other words, it's almost, depending on how it goes, this would be the NIH expecting to sign off on the commercial strategy for the product, right? And that I think is also commercially, I think, a very strange proposition, because access plans that look a little bit like what I described aren't completely new to biotech. They're occasionally encountered when small biotech companies go to funders like Carbex or the Wellcome Fund, the Wellcome Trust.
Hughes
right?
Foundation as well.
Yes, right. And so, but what's typically on the table for these deals is very significant non-dilutive like funding.
Yes.
Provided by the funders, like with a very entrepreneurial spirit, if you will.
It's a business plan about return on investment calculations.
Pretty much.
Yes.
Right? So that's very different from placing a condition on a non-exclusive license with a federal agency where you're getting nothing except the right to practice an invention. Right? That makes it so much harder, I think, to assess this proposal. Nonetheless, right, you see the idea that percolates, and because what it's based on is always the same narrative, and that is the taxpayer invented this, right? And we want more back than what we've been asking for in the past.
The intramural grants are interesting, though, because now we found some intramural grants that had in our patent pool.
Yes.
Because we found some CAR-Ts and there were some intramural grants around checkpoint inhibitors. Now, these are arguably some of our most cutting edge and important treatment pathways. And the reason why certainly CAR-T was brought into a collaboration grant, I think it was a CRADA grant with the Hutchinson Institute of Washington with IP that actually originated not in the U.S., but in Israel. And this was really cutting edge stuff. I mean, using your own T cells to attack cancer. I mean, this is a really hard platform. One would say that this would not have been, it would have been prohibitive to try and develop this because it's also a manufacturing supply chain. I mean, this is really tough stuff. I mean, we're essentially writing off really difficult stuff if we're going to start putting barriers on this. I would think companies would go, no, thank you. No more. And we just probably won't see those being developed, or it's going to really curtail that investigation.
It also brings me back to my jigsaw puzzle analogy, because, certainly CAR-T therapies, cell therapies of this kind have a huge technology stack like on them. It's not just what came out of NIH, which makes the whole product be what it is. Right? So I think there too, I would say commercially, you would say, look, the NIH provided one piece of a big and complex product. The question has to be, what can it expect in return relative to what it contributed to the entire product? And you can even do so in a risk-adjusted way. I don't think the concept is going to compute in the minds of licensing professionals any more than the reasonable pricing clause did. In the 1990s. And that, I think, is probably where I would go if you were to ask me, what do you expect the impact of this new proposed policy out of NIH to be? I would say that's an experiment that we've done. Right? And we know that companies are going to be extremely wary, because what NIH is not doing the same thing that the Wellcome Trust is doing.
No, nor Hughes, nor
Carbex, nor some of these other non-dilutive like funders, where we're talking about very significant funding that's very important for a company.
Gwen, if you could put one thing down from the research you did, what's the real core essence of the finding that surprised you? What's the one thing that you thought, it's like, wow, I wasn't expecting that?
I wasn't expecting for there to be so few with an actual government interest statement. I really thought that there were going to be more than what we found.
And I think that really typifies and identifies the problem. I think the general public and even people in the industry thought that. But in fact, when the rubber hits the road, a lot of these academic studies that have said there isn't that much were actually correct. Hans, do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. And I think it raises... it invites an appraisal of, okay, what is the nature of public research funding or public spending on biomedical science? It's become fashionable to talk about government spending on basic biomedical research as if it were an entrepreneurial investment where the government comes in, puts capital at risk, wants an exit at some point. So it's all couched, I think, at least in political narrative, it's all couched in commercial terms.
Ex deus machina.
But of course it isn't. Most of the research funding, and And I think its importance can't be overstated. I think it's critically important that the United States, I think, generously funds basic biomedical research. But what they're creating is not an investment and an asset in which they're investing. It's more like infrastructure. They're creating a public good, right? Because let's face it, most NIH money that goes into science manifests, if at all, later in the form of scientific publications.
Yeah.
More knowledge.
And often decades afterwards.
Yes, decades after. And anybody who has access to a library or a computer can get the benefit of that research. So it's a U.S.
And not
gift.
just American.
No, it's including the
Yes,
Chinese and the
yes,
Russians. Anybody
yes,
can read this. So,
yes.
So I think it is more proper to think of NIH spending, or at least most of the grants that NIH distributes, as a form of infrastructure investment. I think the public does get a rich return on its investment. The tax base goes up. It creates opportunities for businesses and other researchers to build on what was published. Eventually, products do come out. Right? But I think it's more appropriate to think of this as a form of infrastructure investment than an angel investor or somebody who puts capital at risk for a specific project. Now, teasing this apart, that hasn't happened in public debate. But I think it's studies like yours and the debate we're having about them is a good invitation to appraise of, okay, what does it mean? What can the public expect in return?
Well, Hans, I have to say it's been a real pleasure working with you. It's always a joy. It's also wonderful speaking to you. You're very thoughtful, and we always have a very good conversation. So it's always a pleasure, Hans, and thank you for your time. And Gwen, again, really wonderful job on this study.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, you're now, in full disclosure, Gwen's now a partner in the firm based on her work that she's done, and we're very grateful to have her here. So again, Gwen O'Loughlin,
lovely.
Thank you very much again, Gwen. It's always great to have you here. So with that, thanks very much, and we'll see you again another time.
Thanks for having me.
The executive producer of the Vital Health podcast is Dwayne Schultes. Our editor is Mark Brodeen. Our project manager is Gwen O'Loughlin. The Vital Health podcast is a production of Vital Transformation LLC, copyright 2024.